Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on updates on the American Rescue Plan Act, a national perspective. My name is Ryan Gregoire, and I am the Legislative Director of your New York State Association of Counties. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to participate in this important webinar. Today's presentation from the National Association of Counties will highlight important reporting updates for ARPA state and local fiscal recovery fund recipients and an overview of the final rule. NACo has been a leader on tracking, managing, monitoring, and engaging with our federal partners on the interim rule, guidance documents, and reporting requirements for ARPA. NACo will present on the latest from U.S. Treasury and provide county leaders with an overview of the resources that they have available to assist counties as they continue to implement and develop plans for their ARPA allocations. Before we begin the webinar, though, NYSAC would like to thank our sponsor, Capital Markets Advisors, LLC, for their generosity in sponsoring today's webinar and county governments. Capital Markets Advisors is an independent municipal advisor that provides advice on issuance of bonds, notes, and leases to counties across New York State. The firm's strategic consulting group prepares multi-year financial plans, performs budget analysis, and provides guidance to clients receiving funding through ARPA. Thank you, CMA, for supporting NYSAC's educational programs. And at this time, I'll recognize Jeanette for a brief welcome message from today's sponsor.
Thank you, Ryan. We'll be showing a very short welcome video from CMA, and stay tuned. We'll start right now.
Good morning. I hope you're enjoying today's webinar. I'm Richard Tortora, President of Capital Markets Advisors, and our firm is sponsoring today's presentation. CMA is an independent registered municipal advisor working from offices on Long Island, Western New York, and the Southern Tier to help service the needs of our 350 clients across New York State as they address their financing needs. Our strategic consulting group works with, again, a multitude of clients as they address a myriad of issues involving day-to-day governance, such as preparation of multi-year financial plans, rate studies, consolidation analysis, and related issues. Most recently, we've done a lot of work with our clients in conjunction with their receipt of funding under the American Rescue Plan Act. We hope you will contact us if we can be of service to you. Our contact information will appear at the end of this presentation. Thank you and enjoy the rest of today's presentation.
Also tell you about a couple of housekeeping items for today. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the NYSAC website later today under archived webinars. You can find the recording and a PDF of the slide deck. We also want to encourage you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. To do so, just go to your webinar dashboard, click on the questions tab, and type in your questions at any time and submit them in writing. We will then address all questions during the Q&A after the presentation today. Back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Jeanette. And again, thank you to Capital Markets Advisors for sponsoring today's webinar. Our speaker today is my friend and colleague at the national level, Erin Hurley. Erin serves as the director of NACo's Government Affairs Department, and in this capacity, she assists in the legislative and executive branch outreach and advocacy of the association's legislative priorities and policy development. Over the last year, actually last 2 years now, she has specialized in monitoring the implementation of the CARES Act, Coronavirus Relief Fund, and the American Rescue Plan, Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund at the local level. Erin is one of the national experts on ARPA, and I want to stress that to our listeners today. We are so grateful to have her with us. Erin also staffs NACo's Finance, Pensions, and Intergovernmental Affairs Policy Standing Committee. And in the past, she's also staffed the Human Services and Education Policy Steering Committee and served as a legislative assistant when she first joined NACo. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Erin. Again, Erin, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for that introduction, and to both you and Jeanette for inviting me here today. And of course, thank you to the folks joining as well. So with that, let's just jump right into it. We have a lot of items to discuss as it relates to the final rule for the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. So as you all know, after the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law back in March of 2021, the Department of Treasury, of course, was tasked with developing first an interim final rule and then the final rule, which was released on January 6th of 2022 and went into effect on April 1st. So on this screen here, as you can see, what I like to do typically before kind of jumping into each one of the sections of the final rule, discussing eligible uses, is pointing out some of the top highlights of the final rule, and specifically of key interest to counties. So first and foremost, probably the most significant and beneficial change included in the final rule that NACo really worked with Treasury a lot on kind of throughout the rulemaking process was that now counties are allowed to use up to $10 million of their recovery fund allocation, consider it as a revenue loss, and then use it for any sort of, government service that a government would traditionally provide. Also related to that revenue loss piece as well too is that Treasury did actually update their revenue loss calculation, specifically the revenue loss default growth rate. Under the interim final rule, you actually compared the growth rate to 4.1%, and then they updated that percentage to 5.2% under the final rule. So that was two really big changes, very, very beneficial, that we were happy to see were included. In terms of capital expenditures, there was a lot of clarification in terms of eligible use of or eligible projects, eligible capital expenditures that you could use the funds for, as well as some new requirements specifically associated with capital expenditures in terms of providing a written justification for Treasury how you're using these dollars on these projects. When we're talking about negative economic impacts, you may remember under the interim final rule, that there was a really big emphasis on qualified census tracts, or QCTs. So that was great. You could provide specific support to those populations. But what was very beneficial in the final rule was that Treasury actually just ended up saying, you know what, we're going to presume that certain populations were either impacted or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and then therefore are automatically eligible to receive a broad range of services. Beyond presuming those impacted and disproportionately impacted populations, Treasury also gives counties the authority and discretion to identify other populations that were impacted and again, therefore eligible to receive a broad range of services. In terms of premium pay, what the final rule does is that it just streamlines in terms of how you can administer premium pay, and then also broadens the share of eligible workers that are eligible to receive that premium pay. In a kind of similar vein, when we're talking about the public sector workforce, the final rule allows you to not only hire to your, let's just say counties, your county's pre-pandemic workforce level, but you can actually now, under the final rule, hire up to 7.5% above your pre-pandemic workforce level. So 7.5% higher than what your workforce was on January 27th of 2020, of course, when the public health emergency was declared. When we're talking about cybersecurity and broadband, you can now use any, not just revenue loss funds, any recovery funds for the modernization of cybersecurity. So that means modernization of hardware and software. It also broadens the eligible broadband infrastructure investments that you can make with the recovery funds too. For water and sewer projects, very similar to broadband, it broadens the eligible projects for water and sewer investments to include stormwater projects, culvert repair, dam and reservoir rehabilitation, a lot of lead remediation projects as well too. And then these last two, these are kind of more explicitly outlined in Treasury's FAQs that they've been updating, but just so folks are aware of, you can take recovery funds, you can put them into an interest-bearing account, you can actually earn interest off those dollars, and that interest earned, you can use it kind of more of like your county's general funds. You don't have to spend them in compliance with Treasury's final rule. So that's also a huge benefit. And then finally, and very important here is that whenever you are investing, spending recovery funds, not only do you have to follow Treasury's reporting and compliance requirements, but you also do have to comply with the federal uniform guidance, which Treasury does outline in the final rule, because these funds are considered a federal grant. So just make sure that you are following that uniform guidance as well. So before going into those the sections of the final rule, I also did want to cover some of the more recent information that Treasury has released. I'm sure that for many of you joining today, the second tranche funding is on your mind. So on the screen here, you'll just see this is the process for which you are able to claim your second tranche. So as a quick refresher, the second tranche payment, Treasury will not make those any earlier than 12 months after your first payment. So after you certified for your first tranche, you will not receive your second tranche earlier than a year later. So just as a reminder, what Treasury is doing to prepare for the second tranche, though, is that you will be notified by Treasury when you are able to access those dollars. You will actually be able to access and apply for the second tranche funding 30 days prior to your second tranche payment. So get that information in as early as possible, and then make sure that when you are in there, that has the correct authorized representative and point of contact within that ID.me portal, which of course you used for the first tranche. If that individual is no longer with the county, you need to email Treasury at that COVID Relief IT support email address with that specific subject title, so that they're aware of the fact that that they should be contacting another individual for all future correspondence regarding the recovery funds. And then finally, just make sure that you have an active SAM.gov registration. You definitely are going to need to either have that active registration if you haven't renewed within the last 12 months. Also, the federal government has actually switched from using a DUNS number to using a unique entity ID, or UEI, in SAM.gov. So this is another thing to think of. If your SAM.gov registration has expired prior to April 4th of 2022, not only will you need to, again, recertify on SAM.gov, but you will also need to obtain a new UEI in order to receive your second tranche payments, which will require some additional information. And then in terms of reporting and compliance, this was announced about 2 weeks ago now, and all of this is going to be required for those of you, well, it'll be required for all counties, but most pertinent for those of you joining today who are submitting your quarterly project and expenditure report on July 31st of 2022. So just in a couple months, or I guess in a little over a month now. So outlined on this screen is that now in the project and expenditure report, you are going to be required to provide additional programmatic data for capital expenditures. So simply what you're going to need to do here is outline explicitly what your capital expenditure was, whether it's a vaccine site, job and workforce training center, and so forth, but you do need to identify that. You're also going to be required to provide a written justification in these project and expenditure reports now. This was delayed until this report. It was going to be included in the first April report, but January report, but they delayed it. So what this means is that if you have a capital expenditure that costs at least $10 million, you are going to need to provide that written justification. Those are for projects that are explicitly outlined as eligible in the final rule. And then those that are not explicitly outlined as eligible projects in the final rule and cost at least $1 million, you will also need to provide a written justification. Another requirement around capital expenditures is that you're going to you are going to need to provide a description of your labor requirements. So you will need to report on the strength of the project's labor standards. You have to include information on the presence of a project labor agreement, prevailing wage requirement, or local hiring as well. So that's all outlined in the project and expenditure report. And then for broadband projects, there is going to be some more information required here as well. So you'll need to report out on what sort of technology was used, the total miles of fiber deployed for the project, and in terms of, you know, what was the speed of connection, type of location for this broadband project. And then finally, this isn't specifically related to the project and expenditure report, but again, for larger counties, those with populations of 250,000 and above, you have to submit your annual recovery plan performance report. And so those are also due July 31st of 2022, and a new template was released for those plans as well too, that you will need to submit. This is also in regards to reporting. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Simply, I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware that there is now an alternative to Single Audit Act requirements. So if you are eligible, so if your county received less than $10 million in recovery funds, you are eligible for this, as long as you haven't spent above $750,000 in other federal funds that aren't ARPA recovery funds. So if you are eligible, talk to your auditor. In a nutshell, what it means is that with this new alternative, you would not have to, you know, comply with a Single Audit Act requirement. You could opt in for something that's called an attestation, and it reduces your administrative burden pretty immensely, actually. So just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of this alternative. So now let's get into each one of those sections. So starting with revenue loss, as I mentioned, under the final rule, there are now two ways for counties to calculate their revenue loss. So, you know, folks joining today, you should have submitted your decision on which way you wanted to go in terms of revenue loss in that April project and expenditure report that was due. So you had the ability to either claim that $10 million revenue loss standard allowance, or you went ahead and decided to go with the revenue loss formula. For those of you that decided to go to the revenue loss formula way, just remember that you are still going to be able to calculate your revenue loss at 4 different points in time, understanding the fact that there's sometimes a lag when it comes to revenue loss with this pandemic. Also, in terms of calculating your revenue loss, you now have the ability to calculate your revenue loss on either a fiscal year or calendar year basis, whichever you choose. Though you have to stick with that until the duration of the program. So right until the program is done in December of 2026. And so the big difference here is that you may remember that you were originally required to calculate your revenue loss on December 31st of 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. So now you have that flexibility in there. And then if you did claim the $10 million standard allowance, you are kind of, you know, cruising at this point. Simply what you'll need to do is just fill out your project and expenditure reports and provide an overview of how you are investing those dollars. So in terms of how you can actually spend the revenue loss, this is absolutely the most flexible category within Treasury's final rule. So what they say is you can use the revenue loss funds for government services, and Treasury outlines in their final rule that government services generally include any service traditionally provided by a government. I want to stress here that if just because NACo's received a lot of these questions, if your county, you know, didn't explicitly provide the service prior to the pandemic, but, you know, it's not deemed obviously as ineligible by Treasury, you can use the funds for that. I want to stress that in the final rule, it says services traditionally provided by a government, not your government. Treasury is not tracking, you know, what services you provided prior to the pandemic or during the pandemic. So just remember that this is the most flexible category. You'll see on the left side of the screen, Treasury does provide some good examples of what government services mean. So, construction of schools, hospitals, healthcare services, environmental remediation, purchasing of police vehicles, ambulances, and so on. Really great examples, but you are absolutely not limited to this and to these services. So that's just kind of, Treasury providing examples. I really want to bring your attention to the ineligible uses, and those are really the only restrictions that you have. So you can't use revenue loss funds for debt service, rainy day funds, extraordinary contributions to a pension fund. You can't use them in a way that would undermine CDC's COVID-19 mitigation strategies. You also cannot use them that would violate any sort of terms under the federal uniform guidance, because again, you have to spend the funds in compliance with that. So just look at the ineligible uses. So long as you're not spending them that way, you're good to go. Moving on to the next section, which is public health and negative economic impact. So the key new features here is that what Treasury did is that they were very helpful in the fact that they actually outlined enumerated eligible uses. As part of this, what they did is they went through kind of each sector that may have been negative, impacted by the pandemic. So this kind of goes back to, me discussing at the beginning of the presentation, impacted versus disproportionately impacted. So they go through households, small businesses, and nonprofits. They outline exactly what the definition of impacted is, the definition of disproportionately impacted, what that means, and then they go a step further of outlining explicit services and support that are eligible that you can use recovery funds for. So on the screen, as you can see, impacted households automatically are eligible to receive affordable housing services, childcare, early learning services. Disproportionately impacted households, think of this more as like a community, any sort of neighborhood revitalization activities. You can use it for updating vacant or abandoned properties. So the final rule has been very helpful in outlining exactly what is deemed eligible under the final rule. Also within the public health and negative economic impact section, it goes into detail of what an impacted industry is. So namely, that's the travel, tourism, and hospitality sectors. However, if there is a sector outside of those three that you believe was impacted within your county, you can actually justify that. You just need to demonstrate that there was an 8% unemployment rate within that sector, and then that way you can provide aid. Also, they provide an overview of public sector capacity. So as I mentioned, the fact that you're allowed to rehire county government staff to your pre-pandemic levels or 7.5% above those pre-pandemic levels. You can also use funds for staff retention as well. Of course, we know that's been difficult, especially in the public sector. And then capital expenditures, which I'll go into more detail in just a second. So this is going into more detail about the public sector capacity piece because there are a lot of facets to this. So again, this really applies to almost any local government staff. So this first one is covering payroll and benefits. So that's specifically around public safety, public health, healthcare, and human services employees. You just need to demonstrate, the hours that they're dedicating to addressing COVID-19, the impacts of COVID-19, and you can cover those payrolls and benefits. Again, rehiring public sector staff to those pre-pandemic levels, 7.5% above those pre-pandemic levels as well. When we're talking about support and retain for public sector workers, you can actually provide additional support and pay to those employees that experienced a pay reduction during the pandemic. Of course, you can maintain current compensation levels to prevent any sort of layoffs, worker retention incentives. You just need to make sure that you're within that threshold for those incentives. But again, knowing that, the unemployment rate and the difficulty it is to fill jobs in the public sector right now. You can use money for that. And then in terms of effective service delivery, this is kind of more of like the IT side of county government. You can use the funds to address the court case backlogs. You can bolster up your county's IT system. For example, if you want to hold meetings on Zoom, you can use the funds in that way. And then I did want to touch on capital expenditures, just because this is definitely one that we've received a lot of questions about. So in terms of clarifying what sort of capital expenditures are eligible, you need to make sure that whatever capital expenditure you're doing, using recovery funds, is related to public health and negative economic impacts, and also is proportional to the pandemic impact identified. Treasury is not providing pre-approval for any of these capital projects. So just as a reminder, if you email them, they will not email you back. And then in terms of that written justification that I mentioned, there are 3 key components that you will need to include. So this is capital expenditures that are $1 million and greater, that if it's not clearly outlined as eligible in the final rule, and then any project that's 10 million and above. So it's the description or harm of need to be addressed. So, if you're doing affordable housing, you'll say, we're doing a affordable housing project. We are going to house 100 people. Demonstrate why it's needed. Explain why the capital expenditure is appropriate. So why your county's existing resources are not adequate to address the impact that the pandemic had. And then 3 is a comparison of your specific project against at least 2 alternatives, and why your project is superior to those alternatives. This is simply because Treasury does really put an emphasis on cost effectiveness when using recovery funds. So they want to make sure that, you are not being able to arrive at the exact same outcome if you're, you could use the funds to, bolster up social distancing, testing, vaccines, etc. On this screen here, I won't spend too much time, but simply it just outlines when you're going to have to submit that written justification. So let's look over to the bottom right. So again, when you're filling out your next project and expenditure report, whether you do quarterly or annual, you are going to need to provide a written justification for any capital expenditure that's $10 million and above, or if the capital expenditure is not explicitly outlined as an eligible use and it's $1 million and above, you will also need to provide a written justification as well. And then these are just examples of eligible capital expenditure projects. So as you can see, schools, childcare facilities, medical facilities, emergency operations centers, you name it. The ineligible capital expenditures is the construction of new correctional facilities, new congregate facilities, and then construction of convention centers, stadiums, or other larger capital projects that are intended for general economic development. The reason behind this is that Treasury states is that the recovery fund was actually established to address negative economic impacts, not to generate, general economic development. Something on this slide, though, that I do want to stress, although you see examples of eligible and ineligible capital expenditure projects, that if you're using, going back to that revenue loss piece, if you're using your revenue loss dollars for capital expenditures, you are not limited to this, these specific requirements within the final rule. Think as the revenue loss section of the final rule as almost like completely independent of these other sections. You do not have to comply with these requirements within this capital expenditure section. Moving on to premium pay. So key new features in the final rule, but first, just as a refresher, premium pay is that additional $13 per hour on top of an individual's regular hourly rate, and is capped at $25,000 per person. You can provide premium pay retroactively, so all the way back, right, to January of 2020. In order to receive premium pay, though, you have to make sure that the individual, first, there's a very, very long list of individuals that are eligible to receive premium pay, first and foremost, it's really any employee of the local government, state and local government, but the worker actually needs to be involved in essential work. So that means physical handling of items in person, and then so that what that means is if the individual is actually teleworking from a home, from a residence, then they would not be eligible to receive premium pay. So just want to make sure that folks remember that point. There's actually a 3-step system that Treasury provides in terms of how you can know, or how you can kind of assess and understand if an individual is eligible to receive premium pay. But all in all, what the final rule does is that it really clarifies the types of premium pay and how you can administer it. So it's not just for hourly workers, it can be for salaried workers, it can be for part-time workers. In terms of how you want to administer the premium pay, you can do it in lump sums, installments, quarterly, monthly, annual basis, however you would like to do that. And then the final rule explicitly states that volunteers are not eligible for premium pay. And then moving on to the last section, which is water, sewer, and then broadband infrastructure. Broadband's on the next slide though, but for water and sewer infrastructure, key new features here is that you may remember under the interim final rule, what Treasury did is that they aligned eligible projects for using recovery funds with that of the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which is a broad range of projects. But under the final rule, so the final rule maintained that all of those projects are still eligible under those 2 state revolving funds, but then they added more projects that you could use with recovery funds. So lead remediation projects, culvert repairs, residential wells, stormwater infrastructure, and then certain dam and reservoir rehabilitation that's specifically related to drinking water. And then finally, broadband infrastructure, what the final rule does. So that was also a very big change, is that under the interim final rule, counties were required to invest in households or businesses that didn't have a reliable wireline of 25 megabits download speed and 3 megabits upload speed. That was a big issue because, that was a very specific threshold, right? And there are other households and businesses that need access that maybe don't meet that threshold. So that was a big thing that NACo also worked with Treasury on, actually. So in the final rule, they got rid of that language entirely. So now what the final rule does is that it allows counties to invest in locations without a reliable wireline of 100 megabits download speed and 20 megabits upload speed. So that's really big. In terms of projects, so Treasury actually urges counties to invest in projects that do provide a reliable wireline of 100 megabits download speed and 100 megabits upload speed. So that stayed consistent for the most part between the interim final rule and final rule, but the final rule does also state that, if the project is extremely costly, if it's not realistic to do the 100 based on your geographic location, you do have that flexibility to do 100 megabits download speed and anywhere between 20 and 100 megabits upload speed. And then finally, somewhat related to broadband, again, cybersecurity, you can use any recovery funds to invest in the modernization of cybersecurity. And then just to kind of close out before we do Q&A, I did want to make sure that folks were aware of some of the NACo resources that we have on our website. So what NACo's been doing for kind of actually, the last year or so now is that we've been collecting county recovery fund plans. So we have been contacting, large, medium, small counties across the country to have a better idea of where their areas of investment are when we're talking about the recovery funds. So on our website, we actually have a database. You can go online. You can actually sort by topic. So if you're interested in seeing, well, what are counties doing in terms of broadband infrastructure with these dollars? you can simply click on the broadband infrastructure tab, and there will be many examples of what other counties are doing, and the description, and you actually have a link directly straight to their county website with their plan on there as well. So it's very helpful when we're talking about sharing best practices. So I do urge you to check out that resource. And then we also do have a full-blown analysis of the final rule that's on our COVID-19 recovery fund clearinghouse. Also, if you just simply type in NACo.org, it's one of the very front, very first links on there as well too. There's a JPEG picture of it on there. So it goes into immense detail of every facet of the final rule, and it's a very helpful resource, condenses the final rule down to about 40 pages, whereas the final rule is over 400 pages. So urge you to check that out as well. And then also wanted to make sure that folks were aware of our Untold Stories campaign. What this campaign really is that we want to hear from you in terms of how you are investing American Rescue Plan Act dollars to support your residents and communities, so that our federal partners can have a better understanding of why these dollars are so critical, and really making a difference not only for short-term recovery, but for long-term recovery as well. So if you scan that QR code, you can just pull up your phone, bring up the camera, it'll take you right to that landing page. So we would love to hear from you. You can submit your story online. We have a public affairs team that actually is, traveling across the country to film counties about what they're doing with those stories. So if you're interested in that, we would love to come visit you in New York as well too. So just wanted to make sure that folks were aware of that as well. And then finally, for those of you that are unaware of NACo's annual conference, which is coming up from July 21st to the 24th in Adams County, Colorado. Again, if you scan that QR code, it'll take you to the landing page of the conference website. We will be talking a lot about the American Rescue Plan, eligible uses, how counties are investing those dollars. So it'll be a lot of interesting content related specifically to Treasury's final rule, ARPA, but beyond that as well too. Of course, everyone's thinking about the bipartisan infrastructure law, especially now that funds are finally being, administered through the U.S. Department of Transportation, as well as other federal agencies. So that will be a main topic of conversation as well too. So wanted to make sure that folks were aware of that upcoming conference in Adams County. And so that's it for me. Again, just want to thank Ryan, Jeanette for inviting me to be here today, and for folks jumping on the phone. Really appreciate it. And Ryan, I will turn it back over to you if there are any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. This has been an outstanding webinar. A lot of really pertinent information that you've shared with county leaders. We do have a couple questions that have come in. I think I know the answer to a couple, but I'll let you opine on your opinion here. First question, can you claim both the standard allowance, $10 million, and the 5.2% growth factor, or is it one or the other? This is for the revenue loss calculation.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So with that, you are only allowed to claim one. It's either or, and if you have not completed your April project and expenditure report, I urge you to do so immediately, because that was the one that you actually needed to make that one-time choice of either claiming that revenue loss standard allowance or going with the revenue loss calculation. But it's either or. Unfortunately, you cannot do both. So, I would recommend that if your county received less than $10 million in total recovery fund allocation, both between your first and second tranche, you should definitely claim the $10 million revenue loss standard allowance. And then, just compare it against, if you receive more than $10 million, of course, compare it against the updated Treasury revenue loss formula and see kind of which of a better deal you get.
Great, thanks, Erin. Clarifying question here coming in from Dutchess County. If you're using the revenue loss recovery for capital projects, that does not require justification. Is that correct?
Correct. That is correct. Yep. And you can see that even on the project and expenditure report that you're doing. So if you claim the revenue loss allowance rate, you actually are only able to fill out the project overview section of the actual, the project overview section of the project and expenditure report. You actually can't fill out like subrecipients, subawards, anything of that nature. You simply just need to, provide an overview of how you're spending the dollars.
Great. Erin, what's your opinion regarding the support of a capital project, a hotel expansion, for which less than 1 million of ARPA funds would be allocated? Is that
Ryan,
an eligible use?
Ryan, could you repeat that one more time?
Sure. What's your opinion regarding the support of a capital project, a hotel expansion project, for which less than $1 million of ARPA funds would be allocated?
So that's a little bit harder. This really kind of goes back to, right? You need to justify that it's addressing a public health or negative economic impact. So a hotel expansion is a little bit iffy, just because that seems kind of more general. Again, if you're using your, the funds under the general government services, the revenue loss, that's easier, but the hotel expansion kind of seems like it's almost related somewhat to the construction of like a convention center or stadium. It's like the general economic development. So that one is a little bit iffy. It really, depends if you feel like you can justify that it's, it addresses some sort of public health or economic impact of the pandemic.
Great. And then the last question I have here for you, Erin, is when using the revenue loss funds, and say the county would like to give a town funds to install a sewer line that would be owned and operated by the town with no benefits to the county, would the recipient or subrecipient rules apply to this situation if the county decided to give the town revenue loss funds? And just for some background for you, towns in New York State are receiving local recovery funds that are being administered and passed through by the state government. They were not a direct recipient, but the state is administering funds through the town. So in this situation, could the county still provide revenue loss funds to a town government for a sewer line project?
So, there definitely is the ability for you to transfer funds, like for like a regional project. It's up to the discretion of the county, but you will definitely need to have a subrecipient agreement still and demonstrate that the county is spending those funds in compliance with the final rule.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erin. And again, just for our listeners today, I want to again thank our sponsor, Capital Markets Advisors, for sponsoring today's webinar. And most importantly, I want to thank Erin Hurley from the National Association of Counties for this excellent presentation. And again, for folks listening, if you have questions, please continue to submit them to coronavirus@nisac.org. And Dave Lucas on our team and I are more than happy to bring those up to our experts, meaning Erin at NACo, to see if we can get some answers from either her expertise or from our partners at US Treasury. So again, Erin, thank you very much. I know you've got a busy day of lobbying up on the Hill. And with that, I'll just conclude today's webinar.
Thank you so much again, Ryan and Jeanette. Really appreciate it.